The music you heard was George Gershwin's Sewanee. He wrote it in October 1919 at about the time Anne Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey, the two younger daughters of Major General and Ruth Anne Dodge, were deciding what to do with a finished memorial they had commissioned for the remembrance of their mother, Ruth Anne Dodge. The planned dedication on Decoration Day 1919 should have been a great event, but by April of 1919, Anne and Ella were humiliated and didn't want anyone to see the face of the angel. The memorial was dedicated secretly in the cold of March of 1920 to avoid attention. Gershwin's Sewanee, by March of 1920, when the memorial was secretly dedicated, was on its way to become the first mega hit of the record industry, with lyrics by Irving Caesar and sung by Al Jolson. 2 million records were pressed and 1 million copies of sheet music were sold. Here are Anne Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey. Anne was the driving force behind the memorial and took the artistic lead, working with the sculptor and architect. She considered New York City her home and had lived much of her adult life there in mid-Manhattan on Park Place Avenue. Ella lived in Council Bluffs with her husband Frank Scott Pusey. In Council Bluffs, she, together with her husband Frank, handled many of the local on-site issues. This presentation's title is The Secret of the Angel. It is a secret she has kept for over 100 years. The presentation will cover the following: how the memorial was funded. The money did not come directly from a trust fund specifically for the memorial. The choosing of Daniel C. French, the most lauded and probably the most expensive sculptor of the era. We will look at the site size and location next to the Fairview Cemetery in Council Bluffs. Audrey Munson is the angel's model. The Dodge girls did not choose Miss Munson. The choice of United States' most celebrated woman from 1913 through 1916 was Daniel French's choice. A project timeline will be presented, including getting water to the angel that proved to be a major task. A nationally followed murder that falsely impacts the memory of Ruth Anne Dodge, the 1919 dedication that was cancelled due to the tie-in with the murder. The 1920 private dedication to avoid disgrace, again tied to the murder. On the memorial's granite wall, Ella and Anne are recognized blessing the memory of their mother, but the General and Ruth Anne had 3 daughters. The third sister and the oldest was Letty. She was born in Council Bluffs, and 12 days after her birth, Grenville Dodge and Annie, as Ruth Anne was commonly called then, moved back to their homestead near the village now called Elk City, Nebraska. The Dodges had a farm at the site of what had been the Mormons' northern crossing of the Elkhorn River. Letty was married at 18 to Robert Eglinton Montgomery on November 25, 1874, the day before Thanksgiving. Robert Montgomery was an associate of the Generals in building the Texas Pacific Railroad. She had her first son shown here on the right at the age of 20. Letty named him Grenville Dodge Montgomery. The General's grandson was an honor graduate of Yale Law School, a member of Skull and Bones, and a noted Philadelphia lawyer living in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. For a few years, there were 2 little Grenville Dodges running around Council Bluffs. The General's sister Julia named her first son, born on August 24, 1872, after the General. His name was Grenville Dodge Beard. Grenville Dodge Montgomery and his younger sister Eleanor graduated from the Hill, as the old Council Bluffs High School was commonly called then. It was located in today's Kern Park. Eleanor Montgomery married John S. Ellsworth of Simsbury, Connecticut. The Ellsworths lived in the East Lake Weetag Historic District of Hartford County. Letty's youngest son Robert Langford graduated from the new Council Bluffs High School. The school building later became Abraham Lincoln High School in 1922. It was located on land the General once owned and was 100 yards from the General's home. Robert graduated from the United States Naval Academy and was a young officer on the USS Connecticut, battleship BB-18. This ship was the flagship of President Roosevelt's Great White Fleet when it circumnavigated the globe. The building was used as a junior high school starting in 1967 until October 1976, when it was destroyed by a fire accidentally set by 3 boys that had broken into steal sellable property so they could keep playing at a nearby game arcade. Remember the little girl in this picture from 3 photographs ago? She is Elizabeth, the great-granddaughter of the General and Ruth Anne Dodge. In 1929 she became somewhat of a celebrity in an advertisement by Gorham, the famed silversmith. The ad was titled "One of Philadelphia's Most Important Brides, Mrs. William H. Kingsley." Elizabeth had married into the Pennsylvania life insurance family. Pennsylvania Life was the country's largest privately owned life insurance company at that time. Here are the three girls about the time they moved into the Dodge mansion in Council Bluffs. It was built in 1869 and 1870. The general finished building the Union Pacific Railroad to Utah in 1869. Shortly we'll get to why Letty's name is not on the dedication wall, but first let us get a better understanding of the girls. Letty was beautiful and a daddy's girl with an adventurous spirit like her father. Ella was more reserved but strong. She married Frank Scott Pusey on May 5, 1880, who was the son of a political opponent of the general's. The youngest was Anne. She never married and was mommy's girl for 51 years. We need to set up that the general is an extraordinary man and remembered locally, nationally, and internationally. For the three girls, it was important to have mom remembered and celebrated when she died. Said differently, the girls want mom's passing to me just as memorable as dad. During the American Civil War, Grenville M. Dodge rose to the rank of Major General. He was one of 27 generals to command the Army. An army is the highest echelon of field command next to a theater command. He was one of only 8 generals and 1 colonel to accept the surrender of the Confederate-level army. His name goes into Civil War history next to Grant, Sherman, Edward McCook, Canby, Wilson, Osterhaus, and only a few others. At the beginning of the Civil War, the strategic importance of Corinth, Mississippi was the cross tracks of the South's 2 major railroads. Literally, X marks the spot. That was the reason for the Battle of Shiloh on April 6 and 7, 1860, 19 miles to the north at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. More died in those 2 days than had died in all the country's battles up to that point. 730 miles south of Council Bluffs, General Dodge was in command of the District of Corinth in Corinth, Mississippi. Ruth Anne, the general's wife, was 30 years old, Letty was 8 years old, Ella was 4 years old, and Julia, the general's sister, was 20 years old. They stayed with the general during part of the summer of 1863 at the Veranda House. A block away is where the general had his military command headquarters. Only General Grant took his family deeper into enemy territory, and that was only on the Mississippi River during part of the Vicksburg campaign. General Dodge took his family to Washington City, as Washington, D.C. was commonly called then. The general talked to President Lincoln primarily about the Transcontinental Railroad. Probably an extension of their 2-hour visit in Council Bluffs in August of 1859. Ruth Anne would have met Mary Todd Lincoln, and Letty talked about playing with Tad Lincoln in the White House. Leading up to Shiloh was maybe the most underappreciated battle of the war for the Union, that being the Battle of Pea Ridge as the Union recognized it in northwest Arkansas. Pea Ridge ended the South's chances of taking St. Louis. The truthful adage of the time was whoever controlled St. Louis could effectively wage war on the other. The lemma is assumed that if you don't control St. Louis, you could not wage war with success. Twice the then Colonel Grenville M. Dodge was the deciding factor at Pea Ridge. After the Battle of Pea Ridge, General Halleck, who was in command of the West, promoted Dodge to a brigadier general on March 21, 1862. By May of that year, Dodge had sufficiently recovered from wounds received at Pea Ridge. General Halleck gave Dodge command of the Western District of Tennessee but excluded the Mississippi River. Halleck charged Dodge to rebuild the Mobile and Ohio Railroad from Columbus, Kentucky to X marks the spot in Corinth, Mississippi. This map shows the Mobile and Ohio. The railroad represented by red line existed at the time of the Civil War. The black and green came later. The railroad had been destroyed from Columbus, Kentucky to Corinth, Mississippi by Confederate troops following the Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in the early spring of 1862. It ran over prime cotton field land. There are a few major waterways but small creeks almost every mile. General Dodge most assuredly used escaped slaves that worked for food in rebuilding the railroad between Columbus, Kentucky and Corinth, Mississippi. Escaped slaves did the shovel work and heavy lifting. 2 regiments of soldiers from Wisconsin did the lumber work for ties and bridge timbers. Some of Dodge's other troops worked the track but also guarded the finished track. His troops also fought guerrillas. By June, the tracks were repaired and trains were delivering supplies to support Union troops in northern Mississippi. West Tennessee was Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest's backyard. He was one of the South's best cavalry commanders, and after the war he founded the Ku Klux Klan. Charles Dana was a journalist who had resigned from Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. Dana was sent by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to investigate General Grant after Shiloh. Dana interviewed General Dodge. Dodge had not met Grant but undoubtedly knew of Grant's intense deportment. By whatever means Dodge had rebuilt the 150 miles of railroad in less than 2 months, its success would have been reported back to Stanton and President Lincoln. The underlying connection of many leaders at the time was the railroads. Even during the war, the Transcontinental Railroad was getting started. The Union commander of the Battle of Pea Ridge in 1862 and the Battle of Westport in 1864 was General Samuel R. Curtis. He was from Keokuk, Iowa. Curtis authored the 1860 Railroad Act, but it did not pass. When the South succeeded, the blocking votes went south. The name was changed to the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act and it overwhelmingly passed. Curtis left Washington as the bill cleared the House to fight and command 2 different armies during the war. Charles Dana was later promoted to Assistant Secretary of War in March of 1864. At the beginning of the Civil War, 2 generals took it upon themselves to liberate slaves in territories they controlled. In the East, Major General Benjamin F. Butler, who failed in his attempt to take Richmond shortly after Virginia succeeded, occupied and held Fort Monroe at the mouth of the James River. 3 slaves fled to the fort. General Butler would not return them per the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. General Butler called the slaves contraband, that is, a military asset that could be used by the enemy in his endeavors to make war. The non-military owner of the 3 slaves were in a state that was in rebellion, but the slaves were far from a military asset, therefore, Butler's action was murky at best. In an attempt to legalize what Butler did, the Confiscation Act of 1861 was passed and signed by President Lincoln on August 6. The Confiscation Act makes no reference to living people, only property. The Northern courts had a problem with calling a person, even if they were an escaped slave person, property. Almost nothing was accomplished. Major General John C. Fremont, who was in command of the West, headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri on August 30, wrote an order freeing all slaves in Missouri of anyone supporting the rebellion and the execution of anyone in rebellion. Missouri was a slave state but had not succeeded, therefore slave ownership was with the right of the citizens of Missouri. When Fremont would not rescind his order, President Lincoln relieved him of command. In early October of 1861, 2 months after the passage of the Confiscation Act, a lowly colonel from Iowa with less than 6 months of active duty made sense of the act and how to use it in neutral Missouri. Dodge issued orders to his command that marks the beginning of practical liberation, but not emancipation. The people liberated were not just escaped slaves but any slaves as long as the master was away aiding the enemy, even though they lived in non-rebellious Missouri. Dodge's orders stood without being revised or rescinded. What is important to note is that Dodge makes it absolutely clear it is a military action under military control. He does not use the word free or freedom. In essence, the army became the new master because they are confiscating contraband. Liberation would comes by their new master. In one noted case in Kentucky, Dodge was ordered to bring escaped slaves together with their former masters. Dodge did, but with the Kansas 7th Cavalry in between. The escaped slaves liberated themselves by quickly disappearing into the fields and woods. At other times, Dodge employed escaped slaves as contractors to rebuild railroad lines. Congressmen from non-rebellious slave states had no legal grounds to object. 9 months later, the then General Dodge wrote a letter to Charles Dana that was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. This letter recognized the value of escaped or freed slaves. That was essentially a continuation of Dodge's written orders when he commanded in Rolla, Missouri. It is worth noting that in May of 1862, 6 months after Dodge's order in Rolla, Missouri, Major General David Hunter tried the same thing that General Fremont did in Missouri, but in the areas under his command in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. General Hunter was relieved of command. It is most probable the lawyer side of President Lincoln recognized what Fremont and Hunter's action did would get tied up in the courts, but what Dodge did was straight military and not subject to civil courts, even the Supreme Court. Lincoln most likely read or heard of the letter in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Lincoln would have remembered Dodge from his 2-hour-long meeting at Council Bluffs in August of 1859 discussing the Transcontinental Railroad. They also met at the Republican National Convention in 1860 in Chicago. On July 22, 1862, President Lincoln presented his draft copy of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. Edwin Stanton, The Secretary of War was Lincoln's only supporter for quick enactment. Stanton, with a report back from Charles Dana, must have suspected how General Dodge rebuilt the Mobile and Ohio Railroad through Tennessee so quickly while under fire. On September 22, 1862, President Lincoln made public the Emancipation Proclamation. It would take effect January 1, 1863. The author believes that in some part, General Dodge's action influenced, at least in the timing, of the Emancipation Proclamation. That is, let's get the emancipation started and employ the freed slaves as workers. Dodge, if he was not fighting with the enemy, was building railroads and later became the premier spymaster of the Civil War. By the spring of 1863, escaped slaves, or freed slaves, that were emancipated were being employed by the Union just as Dodge had done almost a year before in Tennessee without the Emancipation Proclamation being enacted. Some historians, as a side note, have called the American Civil War the Railroad War. No other war up to that time had seen the mobility of troops, equipment, and supplies play such an important role. General Grant was put in command of the Department of the Tennessee on October 26, 1862, thereby aligning his Army command of the Army of the Tennessee to the Geographical Department. In both cases, the reference to the Tennessee is to the river, not the state. General Grant put General Dodge in command of the Corinth districts within 2 months after the public announcement on September 22 of the coming Emancipation Proclamation. The two generals put in motion in the Corinth contraband camp for escaped slaves. The camp became the model contraband camp for the Union. The abolitionists, especially Frederick Douglass, criticized the president's executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. They said it didn't free anyone, but the naysayers hadn't looked at a map in the West. At that time, Missouri and Kentucky were border states that permitted slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free slaves in those states and only freed slaves in rebellious states. Tennessee rebelled, but by the late summer of 1862 much of the state was under Union control and had a Union military governor, Andrew Johnson, who had his own slaves. Essentially, Tennessee had the same status as Kentucky and Missouri. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to slaves in Tennessee, Missouri, or Kentucky unless they escaped and went to somewhere where they would not be captured and returned. Guess where Corinth is? It is in Mississippi, a decidedly rebellious state. The northern city limits of Corinth today is on the Tennessee-Mississippi border. General Dodge's contraband camp was the safe haven for any escaped slave from any state including Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. The escaped slaves came from all around. They mostly came from the smaller farms where the master had gone to war against the North. General Dodge operated the camp under his martial law and defied the Fugitive Slave Act. Escaped slaves were not returned, and any escaped slaves standing in the General Dodge's Corinth contraband camp as of January 1, 1863, the date of the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, was forever free. On the east side of Corinth was the contraband camp that General Dodge set up with chaplain Captain James Alexander. In the camp, more than 1,000 acres were under cultivation with 40 acres of prime cotton fields. By mid-1863, the camp was showing at $4,000 to $5,000 profit per month selling food to the quartermasters of Union armies in the area. General Dodge's contraband camp was the premier contraband camp in the country. Other contraband camps were dispossessed lands with escaped slaves squatting wherever they could. The Corinth contraband camp had schools, churches, and a hospital. Escaped slaves that wanted to become soldiers were fully trained, including the use of artillery. On May 18, 1863, a report from General Dodge stated that he had 5,000 escaped slaves in the camp that had volunteered and were being trained as soldiers. Here are pictures from the park where the contraband camp once existed. General Dodge was a deciding factor at the Battle of Pea Ridge, starting with a blocking action on the night of March 6 and commanding the 1st Union Brigade to counter the Confederate attack on the 7th. At the end of the day on the 7th, Dodge's brigade was completely out of ammunition. Under orders from General Curtis, Dodge, with busted ribs, led a bayonet charge. And the general was the deciding factor at the Battle of Atlanta on July 22, 1864. His corps blocked what would have been a deadly pincher with no depth of field. Victory at that battle allowed General Sherman to continue the siege, with Atlanta falling in time to make a huge positive statement for the re-election of President Lincoln. To a great degree, the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado on November 29, 1864, was a response to the Plum Creek Massacre in central Nebraska 3 months prior. Over 100 Cheyenne Dog soldiers annihilated a wagon train heading to Denver after they would not sell a woman on the train from Sidney, Iowa into slavery. After Sand Creek, the Great Plains was shut down by the Cheyenne and the Arapaho with allegiance from the Kiowa and Lakota. General Dodge was put in command of the Great Plains after the shutdown. He was charged with reopening communications and trails to Denver and Salt Lake City. In 40 days in a winter campaign, Dodge reopened the Great Plains. In March of 1866, General Dodge and Chief Red Cloud achieved an armistice, with the Lakota being responsible for keeping and defending the Black Hills and with the Cheyenne River as the southern boundary. The armistice was short-lived, as the Cheyenne and the Arapaho went back to raiding, and the Department of the Interior foolishly blundered in negotiating a peace treaty. On May 10, 1869, the East met the West at Promontory Point in Utah Territory. The general went on to build, consult, or be on the board of directors of 16 railroads, both domestically and internationally. He is remembered as the greatest public transportation civil engineer ever. Besides being in charge of monuments, memorials, and parades, the general took charge of the investigation of the conduct of the military in the Spanish-American War. His committee produced an in-depth 6,647-page report in 339 days in 1907. The general moved from his New York City residence back to Council Bluffs. He stayed busy with his garden, dog, chronicles, and many societies. Major General Grenville M. Dodge died January 3, 1916, at his home in Council Bluffs. Ruth Anne died 9 months after the general. They were married May 28, 1854 in Boston, Massachusetts. They had been married for 61 years. For many of those years, the general had been gone for months and months at a time. They communicated with weekly letters when possible. As Ruth Anne was dying of cancer, she had a reoccurring dream she told her daughters, Anne and Ella. In the dream, an angel with a bowl of water approached her and urged her to drink. In the third dream, she drank the water from the bowl and died shortly after. Letty, who was in Idaho, met Anne and Ella and accompanied their mother's body back to Council Bluffs. The funeral was September 11, 1916. When the Dodge mausoleum was finished a little more than 6 months later, Ruth and the general were interned together for eternity. For Letty, Ella, and Anne, the general had been remembered by Iowa's largest funeral until the burial of President Herbert Hoover on October 25, 1964 in West Branch, Iowa. The general had influenced the world in more ways than most historians can label. Now it was Mom's turn to be remembered and celebrated. Letty had stayed with the general for the last 9 years of his life and took charge of his passing. In Council Bluffs, she initially helped with her mother's passing. For the remainder of 1916 and for the first half of 1917, Frank Pusey was sick and his wife Ella cared for him. By the summer of 1917, Frank was better and Ella traveled to Massachusetts to see the progress on the angel. And clearly took the lead to memorialize and celebrate Mom. One guess is that Anne knew of the Spencer Trask Memorial, the Spirit of Life, in Saratoga Springs, New York. Anne liked a summer in upstate New York and northwest Massachusetts. She may have seen it in person or in a postcard such as this. The one thing that we do know from the archives is that Elizabeth Newton from Saratoga Springs was Anne's friend and knew Daniel C. French. Elizabeth wrote an introduction letter to French on Anne's behalf. French, Henry Bacon and the Piccarelli brothers that did the Spirit of Life Memorial were the same primary team that had just started doing the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The lost wax bronze casting of the Spirit of Life Angel was done by the Roman Bronze Works of Brooklyn, New York. The beautiful Hetty Anderson was the primary model. She traveled to Daniel French's summer home and studio in Stonebridge, Massachusetts to pose for the Spirit of Life Angel. Her bronze body and skin look so real under what appears to be a thin garment actually made of bronze. Except for a cleanup every few years, the angel hasn't changed in over 110 years of life. With the help of Elizabeth Newton, Anne made contact with the most famous and probably most expensive monument memorial team in the country. French, Bacon and initially the Piccarelli brothers. Clearly Anne wanted the memorial to be grand. Other intentions may have been envy, haughtiness, or parity with her older sister Letty, who took care of the general in his passing. The pictures here are of the Lincoln Memorial from the summer of 1918. Most of the cemeteries in Council Bluffs are extremely hilly. There was no space in Walnut Hills where the Dodge family mausoleum was being finished to put a memorial of the size of the Spirit of Life Memorial. Way back in Fairview Cemetery, the land could have been developed to accommodate a modest-sized memorial at the cost of $2,500. The president of the Cemetery Association said the cemetery would waive the cost for the prestige of having a memorial by French and Bacon. Whatever was offered to Anne was rejected. It probably was because it was not big enough and would be rarely seen. Anne wasn't doing all that work and spending all that money to hide a memorial that only a few would see on Decoration Day, if they had family in that part of the cemetery. Originally there were 5 contributors to the proposed memorial: Anne, Ella, and Letty. Also contributing was Philip, as Nathan Philip Dodge Jr. was called by the family. Another contributor was a Mr. Wallace, who did for a time live a short distance away at 37 Bluff Street. There were 4 Wallace brothers of the approximate age of Philip. But which one was initially a contributor would only be a guess. Of the 4 brothers, Robert Bruce Wallace stayed in the Bluff Street mansion until he died. He continued his father's real estate and property management business, which often was tied into the N.P. Dodge Company. By late winter of 1917, the magnitude of Anne's ambitious project was coming to light. It was going to be bigger and more grand than any private memorial in Council Bluffs or the whole state of Iowa, maybe even more grand than any private memorial in the entire Midwest. The Fairview Cemetery already owned and had cleared the land shown here in the yellow box. The site outlined by the yellow box was not big enough for Anne, so through her lawyer, either Stewart or Emmett Tinley, she had the cemetery buy the lot and Bacon House in the red box. Considering the size of the Trask Spirit of Life Memorial in Saratoga Springs, also a private memorial, both plots were needed for the Ruth Anne Memorial Fountain. The financial burden of the memorial, including the cost of buying and tearing down the vacant house, was realized by March of 1917. With that known, Letty, Nathan Philip and Mr. Wallace dropped out. Both Philip and Mr. Wallace had families and businesses to maintain. Letty received an allowance from the Dodge Trust Fund, but the author believes she was assisting her daughter and youngest son. Anne and Ella received allowances but had no businesses or children to support with their money. Daniel French created a plastering model of the memorial, probably with only simple verbal collaboration with Henry Bacon. The two had done the Spencer Trask Spirit of Life Memorial 3 years earlier, and they knew approximately what Anne wanted. French sent the plastering model to Anne, who was in Council Bluffs at the time. Considering other models of his that still exist in his museum today in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, it could have been 2 to 3 feet wide and up to a foot or so deep. From the plastering model as shown here is the letter M, French made solar prints of various sizes. Solar prints back then were made in a dark room with a bright light shining on the model, creating a shadow on light-sensitive paper behind it. After a calculated exposure time, the paper was treated with a chemical wash, then taken outside and exposed to the sun. French, Bacon and probably helpers walked around the double plot site in Council Bluffs with a different size solar prints until they found the ideal setting and the ideal size for the site. The Council Bluffs site wasn't big enough for a Spirit of Life size angel, but close. The Spirit of Life angel is about 1.4 times life size. The Council Bluffs angel is about 1.2 times life. French and Bacon reused the solar print technology they have used in Council Bluffs to size the sitting Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The original sitting Abraham Lincoln was only going to be about twice life size. After using solar prints, French and Bacon made the sitting Abraham Lincoln around 4.4 times life size. The size is perfect for the building. The reasoning behind the choice of granite presented here is speculative. Originally, the Piccarelli brothers who had done the Spirit of Life stone work were going to do the Ruth Anne Dodge Memorial Fountain probably in the light gray Vermont granite like the Spirit of Life. After French and Bacon saw the site in Council Bluffs, they changed to Stony Creek granite. The Spirit of Life had no overhanging trees, so the sunlight on the light gray granite is fairly uniform. In Council Bluffs, if the light granite had been used, moving tree shadows would have been obvious on a sunny, windy day. With the change to heterogeneous Stony Creek granite, the Pickerel brothers were dropped, and the Norcross Brothers Company hired since they owned the Stony Creek Quarry in Brantford, Connecticut. In addition, another special lady stands on Stony Creek granite. This is the end of Part 1 of The Secret of the Angel. A decision has been made by Anne and Ella Dodge Pusey to memorialize their mother in a manner hopefully equal to the remembrance of their father, Major General Grenville M. Dodge. In Part 2 of The Secret of the Angel, we will meet the most celebrated women of the times who will be the model, and we will review the timeline to the completion of the Ruth Anne Dodge Memorial in the fall of 1918.
Hello, this is Bob Swasina, the author and producer of The Secret of the Angel. I hope I've brought out its history fairly. I wish to address copyrights. In this country, most copyrights expire either 120 years after creation, or 95 years after first publication, or 70 years after the author's death, whichever comes first. After expiration, the material becomes public domain. I appreciate collections from public institutions, from the Library of Congress on down. Music is different from images unless you can find and be happy with an old record pressed years ago. With two exceptions that are public domain, I have bought or have been granted permission to use music heard in The Secret of the Angel. At the end of each of the 4 parts of The Secret of the Angel, the credits will be presented with instrumental background music. For Part 1, the piano background music is Jesus, Lover of My Soul, played by Julianne Kitchen. This song was sung at General Dodge's funeral and probably at Ruth Ann's too.